My name is Ember Morrissey. I am an associate professor at West Virginia University, and I've been studying soil and the organisms that live in soil for about 15 years and working in agricultural systems for the last 9 years.
Hi, my name's Kinsey Reed. I'm her Ph.D. candidate, and I'm also a soil health specialist with the WVU Extension. And today we are at the J.W. Ruby Memorial Research Farm in Reedsville, West Virginia, here in Preston County. And we're going to talk a little bit about soil health.
Soil is more complex than it might appear. So if you look at soil, it can look relatively homogeneous, but it's actually a complex mixture. So about 45% of soil is inorganic material, and that's going to be the sand, silt, and clay that are really weathered, tiny weathered particles of rock that have been weathered over a very long time. There's about 5% of the soil that is organic material, and that comes from roots, but also as plant inputs break down, microbes use them for growth, and so you end up with a fraction of that organic matter that's derived from the life in the soil. And the other half of the soil ideally is made up of empty space. So soil is made up of aggregates, these little clumps, and you can think of an aggregate as the functional unit of soil. And in a well-structured soil, there are what we call pore spaces in between these soil aggregates. And depending on how recently it's rained and how well the soil drains, those pore spaces are going to be filled with either water or air. So about half of the soil volume is actually made up of these spaces. Soil aggregates are incredibly important for soil structure. They're actually tiny bits of those inorganic materials held together by organic matter and microbes that live in the aggregates. So organic materials and microorganisms act kind of like a glue that holds the sand, silt, and clay particles together in these aggregates. Soil forms very gradually over geologic time periods, so think millions of years. And that's especially true here in Appalachia, where we have some of the oldest mountains and some of the oldest soils in the world. Over time, a variety of factors work together to determine the properties of the soil that we have presently. Those factors are climate, so think temperature and precipitation. Temperature and precipitation determine how quickly the parent material weathers, and of course time plays a very big role in that as well. Older soils are more weathered, and soils in a climate with a lot of rain like we have here in Appalachia, that's also going to create a more weathered soil. So climate and time, also the topography of the site or the relief is very important. So if you think about a hillside, soils at the top of the hill tend to be a little bit more coarse in texture, so they have more sand particles. And that's because over time, as it rains, the finer textured particles of the soil, so clay and silt, can actually be washed down the hillside, and they tend to accumulate in the more valley regions. And so the topology of the site will influence the properties of the texture at those locations. Another very important factor in soil formation is actually the biology, the organisms that live there. So trees, grasses, especially the plant communities, are going to have a huge impact on soil properties over long periods of time. And that's because they're the major source of organic inputs into the soil. But they also can help weather and break up parent material with their roots. So roots can go deep into the soil, and they can also excrete things like organic acids that will help the soil form over a long period of time. Soil can take, it forms over millions and millions of years in some cases. And so the topsoil that we have is incredibly precious because it's taken so long to come to be what it is. But if it's not managed well, if we don't take good care of the land, we can lose this precious resource that has taken so long to form relatively quickly. So poorly, if the land is exposed, you can lose a significant amount of topsoil in a single storm event through erosion. And it can take a very, very long time to regain what's lost, which is why conservation is so important. Soil health is a broad concept, but it basically describes the capacity of soil to support an ecosystem, both natural ecosystems and agricultural ecosystems. And so when we think about soil health, it's the ability of soil to support productive plant communities, productive crops, and also support the animals and even humans that rely on it as a resource. Soil health is typically characterized as having three primary dimensions. So the physical properties of the soil, the chemical properties of the soil, and the biological properties in the soil. Regarding physical properties, there we're referring to things like the soil structure, which is related to those aggregates that I mentioned previously. Good aggregate stability is part of healthy soil physical properties. The physical properties are also related to how water and air move through the soil. So a healthy soil should have good water infiltration and drainage. So water should be able to move in easily, be absorbed and retained in the soil for a period of time, and also, but not saturate completely and become waterlogged. Regarding chemical properties, here we're talking about the things like pH, but also nutrient content in the soil. So a healthy chemical properties are going to be a near neutral pH, which is what most plants will benefit from, but also the presence of nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, all of those elements that plants need. And importantly, in pasture systems, the more nutrients that are making it into the forage, the more nutrients are making it into the livestock, and then the more nutritious the food that results from that. Biological soil health really refers to all the life that lives in soil. So it's really easy to look at a handful of soil and not think of it as alive. You know, I think most people overlook the fact that soil is thriving with life. So this little clump of soil I have in my hand, even though you don't see any movement here, if you were to zoom in to a microscopic level, there are actually billions of individual bacteria in this handful of soil. And there's also fungi that are producing hyphae that are integrating through the soil structure, as well as microscopic animals, little invertebrates, and things that you might be more familiar with, like the worms that you can actually see with your naked eye. So biological soil health relates to all that life in the soil functioning well, because healthy life in the soil provides a lot of benefits for soil structure and the productivity of the land. Soil organic matter refers to all the organic materials in the soil, and it's arguably the most important component of soil health, and it's one of the things that we can really have a big impact on by proper management of agricultural systems. So when you look at soil, you can actually see that it will contain these clumps of dead plant material. So here you can see this is a root that's maybe from last year's growth. And these plant inputs are the primary source of organic material into the soil. But over time, these plant inputs get broken down by microorganisms, those bacteria and fungi that I was talking about before. And those bacteria and fungi produce more long-lasting organic matter within the soil that's really adhered on mineral surfaces and integrated well into those aggregates and sticks around a little bit longer. All the organic material in soil acts like a sponge. So it does a really excellent job of helping soil retain water, because as precipitation comes down, the organic matter will take in that water and then over time gradually release it as plants need it. So the organic material really increases the water holding capacity of the soil, and that benefits the physical properties of soil health. Organic matter is also critically important for the chemical properties, as this debris contains nutrients. It contains nitrogen and phosphorus, and as it's broken down, those nutrients are slowly released and can be taken up by plants throughout the growing season. Regarding why organic matter is important for biological soil health, it serves as the basis of the soil food web. So you can think of organic matter as food for the soil, because it's what the life in the soil uses. So the bacteria and the fungi are growing on that organic matter, and then the bacteria and fungi themselves can be food for other soil organisms like little worms called nematodes or little invertebrates within the soil that help move around the soil and improve soil structure. Invertebrates in the soil, you can really think of those as some of them are microscopic, and others you can view with the naked eye, and some you're probably very familiar with. So here in this soil, it might not be visible, but we actually have some ants with their larvae here in the topsoil. And soil invertebrates are a very good indicator of soil health, because if you have a lot of organic matter in the soil, that's going to support the soil food web, and invertebrates are really kind of at the top of the soil food web. So you can think of them as like the predators of the soil. And they need a lot of resources in that soil ecosystem to support them. So looking for those invertebrates is a good sign that you have a healthy soil. In addition to being an indicator of soil health, they also contribute to soil health. And they do that by accelerating decomposition, so they can make the breakdown of organic matter a little faster, and that speeds the release of nutrients for plant uptake. So it increases that recycling that's happening in the soil. They also provide what we call bioturbation, which basically is just a fancy word for them moving around in the soil, and that helps aerate the soil and can improve the soil structure and improve water infiltration. So all of these little jobs that our invertebrate friends are doing are really helping improve the soil health. One of the core principles of soil health is maximizing the presence of living roots. So living roots are incredibly important for healthy soil because they provide several different functions and benefits. So if you look at this clump of soil with roots I have in my hands here, you'll notice that I can shake it, and these soil aggregates, many of them will stay on the root structure. And that's because roots, penetrate the soil and they wrap in and around soil aggregates. But they also exude sugars, right? They release some of the carbon that they fix during photosynthesis below ground. And that carbon acts as food for the microbes in the soil, which also produce sticky substances. And so what you end up with is soil aggregates that are really enmeshed with the root system. And this provides a lot of benefits for soil structure. If you have roots that are holding on tight to those soil aggregates, the aggregates are not going to be as likely to fall apart, and that's going to reduce erosion, right? So roots provide this very clear physical benefit. They also are the primary source of organic matter to most soils. So it's easy to look at all of the productivity above ground and think that must be where the organic matter comes from. But for most grasses, there's as much productivity below ground as there is above ground. So if you can imagine everything here, except going down into the soil, that's what the root structure really looks like. And because those roots are already so enmeshed with the aggregates, that organic matter tends to stick around a little bit better than what comes in from above ground. And so healthy roots and the presence of living roots really is what supports the biology below ground and helps maintain good physical structure to prevent erosion and keep the soil healthy. They can also help break up compaction just by growing through areas of soil that had previously been kind of damped down, and it will help break it apart and introduce air and help water reach spaces that would otherwise be too solidified. So you might be wondering how biological soil health influences agricultural productivity. Does it really matter? Well, I would argue that it's incredibly important because microbes break down that organic matter and provide nutrients like I was just discussing, but they can also serve other functions in the plant root system, in the rhizosphere. That's that area surrounding the roots. So one very classic example of that is with legumes. So plants like clover and alfalfa form special relationships with bacteria underground. They actually have these structures on the roots called nodules. And if you look at them, it can look like the root's infected, but this infection is beneficial. So inside of those nodules, there are bacteria living inside the root, and they are able to pull nitrogen from the air and make it available for the plant. So they can actually take nitrogen from our atmosphere and convert it into ammonium, and that ammonium is then going to increase the productivity of that legume. And this process benefits these plants directly, but it also benefits the pasture as a whole because some of the nitrogen leaks out and is available for other plants and grasses to take up. And as the legumes, die from one season to the next, that nitrogen is then released into the soil and increases the soil fertility. So in addition to legumes and nitrogen fixation, there are other beneficial bacteria that live on the roots of crops and pasture grasses. And these bacteria can perform functions like phosphorus solubilization. So they actually produce little molecules that dissolve out into the soil and can help release phosphorus from soil minerals. And that phosphorus can then dissolve back and be taken up by plants. That's true of other soil nutrients like zinc as well. In addition to helping with nutrient acquisition, microorganisms can also help plants take up water. So a very classic example of this is mycorrhizae. And mycorrhizae are just myco, meaning fungi, and rhizae, meaning root. So they're really just root fungi. And they actually live inside of plant roots, but extend out far into the soil. And because they produce a large amount of very, very thin hyphae, it can increase the amount of water that roots can acquire, because they can go deeper and then also go into tiny little spaces that roots might not be able to access. And so by partnering with those fungi below ground, plants can really survive and thrive under conditions that might otherwise be too stressful, like under drought or low precipitation. So keeping those soil biology healthy can provide a lot of benefits for productivity above ground.
So in West Virginia, we have a lot of really fine textured soils with primarily silt and clay. And these soils are a lot more prone to compaction than sandy soils. And compaction in agricultural systems is more or less inevitable, but it's something that we really struggle with in West Virginia for those reasons. And it's something that really limits your productivity. It makes your fertilizer applications less effective. It really interferes with your soil health. And the main ways that you're going to deal with soil compaction is preventative. So right now we're in a plot that was grazed maybe 40 days ago with a relatively high density for a short amount of time. But we're in a spot of the pasture where the cattle congregated. And after grazing, it was mostly bare, and you could see like the hoof tracks and that they had been laying over here. And so it's going to be more compacted. And I don't know if you can see behind me, but you can see the pasture over there is a lot taller than right here. And one of the telltale signs of compaction is you see a lot of these certain types of forbs like plantain, barnyard grass, crabgrass. Basically, there are species that have shallow roots. So the grasses that you normally want are going to have deeper roots, but because of this compaction, they can't get their roots down into the soil. And that's, for grazing systems, the main reason it's a problem. And so if you're looking in this hole here, you can see that there is almost no roots, even where I dug right next to the plant, that go beyond maybe an inch. And it's almost like a sheer wall all the way down. There's almost no texture or like crumbly bits that you can pull out. And I don't see really any signs of invertebrates. There's like one ant, not so great. But like I said, it's inevitable to a degree. You can't control everything your cattle do, but we're going to talk a little bit about some ways to limit this and some ways to heal the soil a little bit. In a lot of cases, compaction is going to be pretty obvious. You'll see water pooling on the surface or bare ground, or you just know that that's where the cattle were standing and congregating, compacting the soil. But even in pastures where you graze it well and you can't visibly see any obvious signs, there are ways to monitor compaction over time. And the main one is with the penetrometer, which is essentially a rod with a gauge on top that reads the pressure. I didn't bring mine, but I did bring a metal rod, and you can use a fiberglass rod or a step-in post. And if you have a good memory, you can kind of keep track over time by going to under a fence line where you don't run any equipment, you don't have cattle in there, so you can kind of consider the fence line as almost a baseline compaction. So this is what your soil would be like if it had no weight on it. And so you can kind of stick it in there. If you have the penetrometer, you'll actually get a reading and push it in. That was actually pretty easy. Makes sense because never had anything on it. But if you go over here into the spot where I know it's compacted, I can see it's compacted, and you put the same rod, you really have to put a lot of force in it. And I actually can't make it go much farther down than that. So with a penetrometer, you can actually get those numbers and make a ratio called the pasture compaction ratio and monitor how it changes over time. So the pasture condition ratio has actually been found to improve when you use graze, or when you rotationally graze and let pastures rest for a period of time after grazing versus continuously having cattle walking on it. Soil compaction is bad for soil health because you're squeezing all of the air and water pores out of the soil and compressing those clay and silt particles together, such that no nutrients, water, or air is available to the plants or the microbes in the soil. And basically, you're not going to have productive forages, you're not going to have soils that can hold water, your fertility treatments aren't going to be able to sink in and get absorbed by the plant. The list doesn't end. It's kind of your foundation for healthy soil, especially here in West Virginia. And so one of the ways, the most obvious way to prevent it is so you never drive heavy equipment on wet soils, period, end of story. And when you graze, you need to be moving cattle to reduce, ultimately the end goal is to reduce how long there is any singular hoof on any particular area of ground. You want it to be as little time as possible, but still maximize all your grazing benefits. And that's usually accomplished through rotational grazing or even mob grazing. And so really that works because you're maximizing those living roots. the plants will have time to recover in between grazing, and the growth below ground will mirror your growth above ground. And so, in particular, these native warm season grasses get tall enough that their roots go deeper, and they're able to help your soil compaction, help transfer carbon deeper into the soil, and they do well in the summer months. And we won't get too deep into the grazing management in this section, but I do want to mention a few things that will really improve your soil compaction issues a lot. Beyond implementing rotational or multi-paddock grazing, recommend during the winter choosing a particular sacrifice area that maybe is not on a lowland, maybe is a little bit less clayey, because those soils are even more prone to compaction. If you have the option, choosing soils that are sandier or rockier, maybe on a slight incline or on a ridge top, is a preferable sacrifice area to lowlands and anywhere where it's going to be harder to recover that soil. Another thing you can do in the winter when soil compaction is most common and prevalent is bale grazing by unrolling bales over a larger area so that no cattle are congregated in one particular spot. And that does require a lot more work, and maybe you waste a little bit more hay, but that hay will actually go and feed your soil along the way, so it's kind of like a win-win in that regard. So as far as soil health is concerned, winter grazing with bales, putting sacrifice areas if you have to use them on certain areas that are rockier or sandier, and moving cattle often. Well, it's not an issue in pasture systems normally. Using no-till or reduced-till methods and row cropping system can also improve soil compaction over time. Although while tillage and deep subsoil aeration might help compaction temporarily, there's been a lot of research that's shown that it's not continued on after the season, because you destroy your aggregates in the process, and as it weathers / it gets trampled, it actually settles into even more compacted states. So it's always better to start that process of regenerating your soil structure naturally or through agricultural means. Compaction isn't the only issue we face in West Virginia in regards to soil health, but I'm going to talk about the next couple in a more broad sense because they'll be covered in other sections. But there's no getting around management. In almost every analysis we do or other researchers do, grazing management is going to matter more than climate, it's going to matter more than fertility, and it's going to matter more than what you have growing for soil health. So if you don't have your management in a certain realm of what's good for the soil, anything else you do might not have much of an effect. And so in that regard, briefly, good grazing management is leaving at least 30 to 60% of your plant matter above ground after grazing. Obviously cows don't get the memo, so they might eat some things down and leave some things higher, but in general you want to have between 3 and 6 inches of growth left over after grazing. And the reason why is because when cows graze it all the way down to the ground, the roots will actually slough off, and those roots will get shorter and shorter and shorter over time, and then your plant isn't feeding your soil anymore. So your soil will essentially slowly lose its structure, it'll lose fertility, it'll lose organic matter, and it'll get more compacted over time. So it all comes back to that grazing management. And once you have your grazing management figured out, or during that time, you can start talking about soil fertility. You can build the house, but you still need to provide the food. And a lot of our soils in West Virginia are phosphorus deficient. If you've ever tried to frost seed clover and it won't take, your soils are probably either too compacted or low in phosphorus. I'll let the nutrient management people talk more about that, but never apply fertilizer or lime without a soil test, and always use recommended amounts, and wait the appropriate amount of time for those things to take effect before seeding anything. And so after fertility and management are sorted, that's where what you have growing, I think, is the next most important factor for soil health. And something of interest to our lab and something we research is how forage diversity actually improves soil health over having monocultures of, say, tall fescue or orchard grass. And when we talk about diversity, we're not just talking about adding clover. We're talking about having cool season grasses like orchard grass, warm season grasses like this big blue stem, mix it with different types of legumes, red and white clovers, and then also having some forbs in there Plantain can actually be a really good grazing forb if grazed young, and those actually create a more balanced diet for cattle over time. But what we're really interested in our lab is how those things actually improve soil health. And the proposed theory is that by having these different root lengths and also these different plants that release different types of sugar, you're actually feeding your microbial herd below ground. And those microbes reproduce, they go kind of crazy, and when they die, their necromass, or like their dead bodies, are really sticky, and those stick to our clay soils really well, and it actually retains that carbon for a long period of time. And it's not just carbon, it's organic matter. And as we said before, organic matter is kind of like the gold standard for soil health. It has almost every benefit you can list under the sun, and it really makes your soils resilient. And so far we're in about 3 years into this experiment, and we've already seen gains when you combine pasture diversity and good rotational grazing of like 3% organic matter in 3 years in some of these pastures. So it's pretty incredible. We'll have more about that in a couple of years, but just wanted to touch on it. So in essence, for soil health, you want to have good grazing management. You want to make sure your soil fertility is in the recommended parameters and you're not too acidic. And you want to know what you have growing. And there is a tool. If grass identification, speaking from experience, can be somewhat challenging, especially if you don't have a seed head. But there are a lot of technology apps out there like iNaturalist and Seek that you can actually take a picture of the plant and it'll tell you what you have growing. And then you can, from there, research how best to manage those stands, or if you need to renovate them. So one way to tell if soil is too wet to drive on or too wet to graze heavily is called a ball test. And basically, if a soil is too wet and you roll it in you dig a little hole, you dig up some soil, and you roll it in a ball, and it basically forms a nice little mud pie there and it doesn't fall apart, your soil is probably completely saturated and it's too wet to drive on. This indicates that when you drive, you're going to squeeze out all those air holes, and there goes your nice soil structure. But, we'll try this. If you go to do it and you try and make a ball and it just kind of crumbles apart, you're probably good to go. So just a simple test to know when.
So one way to assess the physical health of the soil is to submerge it in water and see how stable the aggregates are. So here we have 2 soil samples, and we're just going to set them in water and see what happens. And when the soil enters the water, water's going to start penetrating all the pores and getting in between aggregates and inside of them. And this will start to loosen the soil up, and it can cause the aggregates to come apart if they're not very stable. And the way that this can be quantified is what's called wet aggregate stability. And so generally, when soils get compacted and soil health is compromised, there's a reduction in wet aggregate stability. And this means that whenever pressure is placed on those aggregates when they're wet, so if cattle are placed or cattle are moved onto the soil when the soil is wet, or any sort of equipment is driven over the soil when it's wet, that will compress the aggregates and cause them to break and fall apart. So what will happen is that when aggregates are not stable in water, they'll fall apart, and a lot of those clays will be released, and that will cause the water to start looking more muddy. Whereas if the aggregates are stable and intact, they will not fall apart in the water when it's agitated, and they'll retain their structure better. So this is one way that we quantify the physical health of the soil. So one of the most important soil health measurements is actually also one of the simplest, which is soil organic matter. So to measure soil organic matter, you simply weigh out a soil sample, you make sure it's aired, you make sure it's completely dried, and then you put it in this furnace. This is called a muffle furnace. It gets up to over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And whenever it gets to that high temperature, all the organic material in the soil actually burns off and comes off as carbon dioxide and leaves the soil. And so you put it in here, and then after it's burned off, you can reweigh the sample. And just by using that difference in weight, you can determine how much organic matter was present in the soil through this simple method. Another way that soil health is often measured is by soil respiration. So as microbes and bacteria and fungi in the soil break down organic matter, they release carbon dioxide. And if we put the soil in a closed headspace container, so here we're just using a mason jar, that carbon dioxide will accumulate. And then we can actually measure how much carbon dioxide is produced over a given period of time for a certain amount of soil. And using that, we can measure how active the biology in the soil is. So to do that, we have a sample that's been sitting for a while, allowing that breakdown to happen. And then you can simply collect some gas from the headspace. Once we have a sample, we can analyze it on an instrument that measures the composition of the gas. So this instrument is capable of measuring the carbon dioxide concentration. And it will pull this gas sample in and actually provide a reading of the amount of CO2 in here. And that will allow us to measure the biological activity inside the soil. So as I mentioned previously, there's a wide variety of microbial life that lives on and around roots. Here we have just a few isolates of different bacteria that were isolated from the surface of roots. So you can see they have different morphological characteristics as illustrated by the different colors. And they also have different growth patterns. This is a bacillus that grows in a radial growth pattern. And there's also a wide assortment of fungi that come in all sorts of different textures and colors. And this just gives you an idea of some of the microscopic life that we can't see, that whenever we grow it in culture so that it's more visible, we can see there's a whole diverse world of life living on the surface of roots, and they interact with plants and help build soil health.
So like we talked about in the field, soil aggregation is a really good indicator of overall soil health. And beyond just digging a hole and looking at it, there's actually a way to quantitatively measure it that anyone can do thanks to the Soil Health Institute. They developed an app called Slakes, and basically all you have to do is dig up some soil, you air dry it for a couple days, and then you dig out these little PEDs and you'll put them in a little dish, clear dish, and then you'll add water. And you use your phone to measure how much those aggregates disperse over about 10 minutes. And then it puts it in an algorithm and spits out a number between 0 and 1, 1 being the most stable, i.e. they don't fall apart at all, and 0 being they dissipate almost immediately the second they get in water. And this correlates with organic matter, it correlates with microbial activity, it correlates with microbial abundance. So it's a great accessible indicator that anyone can do at home or at work.
So when we measure chemical soil health, one way of doing that is through soil extractions. So we put a little bit of soil in here with a salt solution that will help release any of the nutrients and other ions that are bound onto the soil surface. And then after those nutrients are released, we can filter the sample and analyze the resultant extract for the amount of dissolved nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, and other nutrients in the soil to determine whether the fertility is what it should be for a productive system.
This virtual pasture walk is brought to you by the West Virginia Conservation Agency, funded through the NRCS Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative. For similar content, please visit grazingprofessionals.us.